What are REST and RESTful API? Let's quickly understand with the help of a diagram which you might already know, but let's revise quickly. A user first opens the browser and enters the application URL, right? Then a request will be sent to the UI server, which is mostly created in React, Angular using CSS, HTML, JavaScript. Okay, then the UI server can process the static HTML by itself, but for the dynamic data, it will send the request to the server side API. And this REST API can be created in Node.js, Java, .NET, etc. Then this API will fetch the data from the database and send the response in JSON format back to the UI server. Okay, and the UI server will process it into HTML and send it to the user browser. Okay, so that's the process, and now you know this server side application we call the REST API and sometimes backend application also. So what is the meaning of REST here? Here, REST, which stands for Representational State Transfer, it's an architectural style for designing the network applications. Or you can say that REST is like a guideline, set of guidelines for creating the APIs. Okay, now here the meaning of this representational state transfer means transferring of data accurately in a network. That's the like meaning 99% synonymous. Okay, so finally, what is RESTful API then? So a RESTful API is a service that follows the REST principles or guidelines. Okay, here it is written. REST API and RESTful API are the same things. Okay, great. Now you know what is REST, and now you want to know what are the REST guidelines, right? That I will cover in upcoming question. What are the HTTP request and HTTP response structure in the UI and REST API? I know it's a very basic question, but sometimes we start exploring the advanced things without remembering the basics. So I don't want to take that chance. So let's quickly see the structure of the HTTP request and response first. Okay. So here is our basic flow between the user, browser, UI server, and REST API. You already know this. Now, first time when the HTTP request will go from user to browser, from browser to UI, then it will be something like this. Here you can see we have this an action post and URL at the top. Then the type of the request we have, which is HTTP. Then we have the UI server address where the request will go. Okay. Then we have the request body, and the user is trying to do some sign up in this website, therefore sending the username and password in the request body. Okay, finally we can also have the request header and content type here also. So request header contains some additional information about the request. Okay, and content type is like content format. For example, here content type is text. Great. That is the idea when we send the request from UI server to from our browser to UI server. Now, based on the request received, the UI server can do some operations by itself. For example, sorting, filtering, static data, or images sending to the browser. That UI server can do. But for the dynamic and the additional data, the UI server will forward the same request to the REST API. Okay, and here in the request everything will be same as the previous HTTP request, but only this address can be different, will be different. Of course it will be different. This time it will be the API server address, because this time request is going to the API server now, right? Now the REST API will fetch the data from the database or somewhere, and it will respond back with this response. Okay, and here we have the status code, which is like the request is failed or passed, like that. Then content type will be there, which is content format, you can say, which is JSON in this case. And then the content itself will be there, the whole content, like the JSON format, in the JSON format. Okay, now this UI server will receive this JSON and will convert the data JSON into HTML elements, and finally send the HTML content to the browser like this. And browser will of course display it to the user. Great. I think that is the whole flow, and it can be a good revision if you are doing it again, and otherwise it can be a very good learning for understanding the complete flow. Okay, now you know what is the difference between an HTTP request from the user to the UI, and then from the UI server to the REST API, and what is the difference between, especially between the response from the REST API to UI and from response from UI to the browser. So now you know the differences, right? Now in the next slide, I have written some differences, very minimal and simple theory about HTTP request and response. I already explained, but some pointers can help us in better revision, right? That's why I have written it here. What are the top 5 REST guidelines and the advantages of them? So whenever we create any RESTful service, you must follow some REST guidelines. Then only your service will be called RESTful service. Okay, let's explore 5 guidelines and let's understand them. The first and the most important one is the separation of client and server. This is first guideline. It means the implementation of the client, the UI, and the implementation of the server API must be done independently. Okay, and as you know, now we create separate applications for the client UI and separate for the API in Node or something. But in earlier days, we used to create single application that had both UI and the server in one single monolithic application. So that single application was the violation of this guideline. Okay, but yes, now we mostly keep the UI and APIs separately. Okay, that is separation of client and server. The advantage is both client and server application, if they are independent, then the maintenance of them will be very easy because they are separate, right? Okay, and also for a single API server, you can create multiple UI applications, right? Like Android application for single API, Android, iOS, browser based application, web application. So that is also one advantage. The second REST guideline is that APIs must be stateless, meaning the server API server will not store anything in it about the HTTP request. So the client will send some HTTP request, but server will just respond something, but will not store anything about the request. Okay, so that also means that API will treat every request as a new and fresh request, right? Because it does not have any information. Again, in old applications, we store sessions on the server side, but that was again against the REST guidelines. Okay, the advantage of not storing anything on the server is that server is then very lightweight and simplified also, because it is not overloading itself with the state management problems. Okay, those are big problems. Third important guideline is a uniform interface. Uniform interface means one URL of API must represent a unique service of the API. Okay, for example, suppose your API is an e-commerce application like abc.com. Let's say e-commerce. So abc.com/API/shoes, this URL must be unique and uniform. It must get the shoes list from your website by okay. So now in your API, you should not anytime redirect this URL for getting the shirts or something else. So that is the meaning of uniform interface. The advantage is that these standardized URLs make API resources easy to understand and easy to use also. because of course then by looking at the URL only, you can easily identify that what service it will provide, right? Okay, so now the fourth guideline is cacheable. Sometimes your API receives same requests multiple times, millions of times, same request. Now the response of these kind of requests must be cacheable, meaning caching is a different concept, but if you know little bit about it, so it will improve the response speed and performance will be very much increased if the frequently accessed data will be cached. Okay. uh, okay, and then the fifth guideline is layered system. Your API project must follow some layered system like MVC architecture. The advantage is that layered is a very good for modular design, because in modular design we divide applications in separate modules, right? And those modules can be then handled independently without impacting each other. Okay, so that is eventually the benefit of modular design. All right. Yes, there are some more guidelines, but I think these are the top five. And out of these, you should remember 3 to 4 guidelines. And whatever I have explained, also I have written here those points with the advantages here. So that your last minute preparation just before the interviews will be very fast and quick. Okay. What is the difference between REST API and SOAP API? Some years ago, before REST APIs, SOAP APIs were very popular. Okay, now let's quickly see the differences between them based on the features. First is architecture based difference. Remember, REST is an architectural style. Okay, whereas SOAP is a protocol, simple object access protocol. It's not an architectural style. Second difference is REST API uses HTTP or HTTPS protocol only, whereas SOAP API can use various protocols like HTTP, SMTP, etc. Next is REST API uses lightweight formats like JSON XML only, whereas SOAP API typically uses XML. Okay. Then next is REST API are stateless, you know it, whereas SOAP API can be stateful or stateless also, depends. Next is REST API relies on HTTP status codes like 200, 201, etc. Whereas SOAP API define its own fault mechanism. Okay, every SOAP API will can define its own different. So that's a problem actually. Now I'm going the last difference between them, because of which SOAP API are very popular nowadays. Sorry, REST API are very popular nowadays, and that is REST API are generally lightweight and faster, whereas SOAP API can be slower due to XML processing. Okay, all right. These were some differences between these two.